This week we covered Chapter 11, which was over persuasion and persuasive speaking. With that, there was 11.1 and 11.2, so it was pretty brief. 11.1 covered the root of persuasion. It started off by discussing Aristotle's artistic proofs. This would be logos, pathos, and ethos. Logos is something that gets at your logic, so it's an appeal to logic, which is meaning how you think. So with that, logos is actually getting at how you think about things in the logical perspective rather than an emotional or something related to ethics. With that, we move on to Aristotle's second proof, which is actually ethos, which is relating to your ethical standpoint. So with that, a speech that relies on ethos would be getting at your ethical standpoint and making you think about your ethics and whether or not this is an ethical or not ethical decision rather than just the logical side of it. Moving on to Aristotle's third proof, this is pathos. Pathos is referring to your emotional standpoint. So basically this is getting at your emotions and how you feel about it from your emotional side. The root of each of these words actually alludes to what it means, so logos, logic, ethos, ethics, and pathos, pathological. Moving on to 11.2, this was covering organizing a persuasive speech. So your speech obviously needs to be organized. So basically you need to figure out what type of question you're asking. It can be a question of fact, a question of value, or a question of policy. With a question of fact, as it alludes to, you're persuading somebody based on fact. So you're using your facts to try to make this person believe in what you're saying and side with how you feel about it. If it's a fact, it is a fact, and this is how you build your speech, based off of that. A question of value is based on a person's beliefs. So obviously their values relate to their beliefs, and this ties into how you're going to try to persuade them to see your view on the speech. With that, you're going to have to use the values that you think your audience has. You can't just go basically off of your own values, as your audience might not share these values, meaning that their beliefs are different and will have different feelings on what you're talking about, perhaps. A question of policy is asking your audience to take a side. So basically, do they agree with this or do they agree with that? It's usually an A or B thing that they have to take a side on. It's usually not in between. It's usually something cut and dry that is A or B. So a question of policy is asking your audience to pick one or the other, based off how they think. So you have to decide what question you're getting at. Deciding which question figures out what pattern you're going to use, because this is how it's arranged and presented depending on what you're trying to argue. So if you're trying to display the information from a logical way, you may arrange it differently than if you're going to come at it with a question of policy. So a question of fact, you might display it starting with your fact and then going from there. A question of policy, you might have your people, your audience, picking their side based off of something else, so you would arrange it differently. So with that, that was chapter 11, covering persuasive speaking and persuasion, and the root of persuasion, and organizing a persuasive speech. So I did not know that there were actually all the patterns that you could choose to arrange your speech. There were many more than I actually thought that would help you promote your point. These are important to public speaking because a big part of public speaking is persuasive speeches. So these actually help you figure out what it is you're actually asking, meaning which question you're choosing, and how you're actually getting the speech put together based off of whether it's a question of policy or a question of values or a question of their beliefs or policy. So along with that, you have to choose these based off of what you're trying to deliver. What you're trying to deliver picks on which one you're going to use, because obviously you would choose a different one depending on what you're actually trying to deliver and say. These same tactics actually relate to real world and other classes. So if you're in a position of power or authority at work and you're trying to convince your employees of something, you might use fact over their beliefs. Because if you don't share their beliefs, you might not want to use a question of policy, because that won't be as effective as using a policy of fact. So that is the basis of chapter 11, meaning 11.2 being the root of persuasion and 11.2 being organizing a persuasive speech.